So before we start, I just wanted to thank you all very much for coming in person. I thought a lot about this event and the fact that the Ethical Slut is a title that some people may not be familiar with or comfortable with, and we are in a corporate environment, so I think it's so cool that you all came in person, and I'm just so happy to see your faces and to have you here. And we're really lucky to have Dossie Easton with us. So this is our third event in the series on modern romance. And for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Logan Ury. I help lead a team here called the Irrational Lab, and we're a behavioral economics unit. And it's my pleasure to host this modern romance series. So a little bit more about Dossie. She is a psychotherapist, relationship counselor, educator, and author. Along with Janet Hardy, she has co-authored several books, including The Ethical Slut, A Guide to Infinite Sexual Possibilities, Radical Ecstasy, SM Journeys to Transcendence, When Someone You Love is Kinky, the New Topping Book, and the New Bottoming Book. And I'd like to give her an award for best book titles. And since 1969, she has lived and worked in sexual minority cultures. She is dedicated to feminist, polyamorous, BDSM, spiritual, gender diverse, and LGBTQ individuals and communities. She also offers authentic, respectful, and compassionate psychotherapy and relationship counseling to people exploring non-traditional lifestyles. Dossie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here.
Great to have you. So I'll ask some questions, and then we'll save about 20 or 25 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So first, let's start at the beginning. What is polyamory, and what is an ethical slut? Why is that the name of your most famous book?
Okay, we could get really argumentative about what is polyamory. To my mind, it has become the umbrella word. And people ask me questions like, what's the difference between polyamory and non-monogamy? And I say, I don't know. Because inside that umbrella, there should be the freedom for everyone, and that means each and every one of you, to decide how they want their relationship to be and how they want it to be at any given time in their life, because those things also change over time. So it's that freedom to decide that I think polyamory is about for me. It was originally coined by Morning Glory Ravenheart Zell, great name, to refer to her lifelong lifestyle of culturing and developing and nurturing group marriages. And so it meant something a little bit smaller. But what it opened the door, I think, for a lot of people to, is to say, our relationships, whatever commitments we make in terms of finances or mortgages or children or whatever level of that kind of life partnership we enjoy with any given partner, but all of our relationships are indeed partnerships, and all of them are not only about sex, but also about love and about connection and about emotional connection, and I really do believe that. At the time, because the definition was kind of in question, and we're very proud, actually, that the OED actually called Morning Glory and asked her for a definition of polyamory, so we were very proud of that. It's the only person I ever knew got called up by the OED to investigate a word she invented. Good work. This started out as kind of a joke. We had written the bottoming book and the topping book, and we were at a Mensa conference in Asilomar. And we had been talking about negotiation in BDSM, and Janet and I had done some flirting on the stage, and our partners were there, which everybody knew because we had introduced them. And we came out of the room, and instead of talking about all of the interesting stuff that we had talked about, this woman was saying, did you see her? She was flirting with that woman, and her husband was sitting right there. That was all she could see. That was all she could see. And we were both certainly, I've been consciously non-monogamous since 1969. It's like a vow I took as part of my feminism. I'm serious. I didn't want to spend my life looking for a spouse, to complete me. That wasn't what I was doing. And so this became kind of a joke. We were writing it. People would say, what are you writing now? We'd say The Ethical Slut. And they all knew what that meant because they were all sluts. And then when it came time to make a name for the book, when we finished the book and it needed a title, and we explored, polyamory for the new millennium and all that kind of stuff. And it just didn't ring, So it became The Ethical Slut. It remains The Ethical Slut, and I'm very proud of it because I have a lifelong career of laundering dirty words.
So what does it mean to be an ethical slut?
It means to have a celebratory and adventurous approach to sexuality, to own your own sexuality, to share it, as Janet wrote, I love this, a slut shares her sexuality as a philanthropist shares money, that we go out there, men and women alike, and we proudly grasp our sexuality and adventure in it. And at the same time, we do that with due respect to all the people who are affected by, that we connect with, and their people and anybody else who's affected by what we do. So we have a high set of ethics, which is how we manage to make this sustainable. Does that make sense? Because the culture had it that, if you went out to a club and you picked somebody up and you went home and you fucked, and then the next morning, if you weren't going to marry them, you could never speak to them again. And it was all then that was all what I call sport fucking. That was supposed to be really distant and armored. And that wasn't what I meant at all. I meant people actually connecting with each other, which means that we have to keep ethics in mind.
Great. So as I was doing my research, I read about a lot of misconceptions around polyamory, especially the difference between polyamory and polygamy, and between polyamory and cheating. Can you talk a bit about some of those common misunderstandings?
Polygamy, by the way, is a strange word because usually they mean polygyny, or which is like misogyny, which means one man, many women. But this has been the culture. I had a reporter from Salon call me up to ask me about three-ways, and it turned out that it had never occurred to him that a three-way could happen in any way except for one man and two women.
I'm sure you gave him an education.
He was quite shocked. I think he was horrified.
That's great.
So that is one aspect, and the other aspect that differentiates us from cheating is that we are transparent, and we make be very careful about consent, and ideally, and in this I kind of agree with Morning Glory, ideally, our partners, or at least any of them we go on to date longitudinally, meet our other partners. Because frankly, if I get a new lover and they come home with me and they can't be respectful toward my partner that I live with, or my baby, because I was 3 months old when I decided this. My baby was 3 months old when I decided this in '69. Then that's not going to be real sustainable in the long run. So my thoughts are that it works a lot better and everyone's happier and feels more secure and more together if everybody knows everybody and everybody is there and we all get it that we're all on the same side. Nobody's competing with anybody, ideally.
Great. So I read an interview with you online where you said, I spent a great deal of my life feeling like this completely isolated weirdo nut. How did you find your people, and how did you come to do the work that you do?
Well, I was very lucky that I made this decision in San Francisco 2 years after the Summer of Love, which did help,
Right place, right time.
Yeah, right. And living communally as a single mom, that worked too, because there were a lot of post Summer of Love single moms. It was. But to bring up children was our statement about saying that our culture was not something we were going to outgrow, but something that we were going to bring on into the future, which makes me very exciting about how many of you go to Burning Man? Yeah, right. Okay. You think that has some resemblance to the Summer of Love? I think it does. So that part, I had friends and stuff, but what really got me going, a lover of mine named Maggie Rubenstein was one of 3 women who founded an institution that still exists called San Francisco Sex Information. And Maggie said, you got to come volunteer, right? And so I came and volunteered. And the education I got, I thought I knew everything, so the volunteer training was a revelation to me. I learned so much. It was just wonderful. And I got to join a community of people who talk about sex all the time. Svissy runs a sex information switchboard where you can call up and ask a question, something's on your mind, and somebody who knows what they're has trained in as a peer counselor will talk with you and help you out with that. And so talking about sex at a time when there was very, very limited language, okay? Svissy is actually one of the major agencies in developing sex-positive language. That was one of our, because we were talking to people on the phone, you couldn't wave your arms around, So that was gave me a core of 1,500 people who wanted to radically explore sexuality and to take all the oddities that we had heard from the culture and question them and put them up for question and see what it took to, I think of it as outgrow, but maybe it's grow beyond what we were taught as children we were supposed to be and do around sex. Does that answer?
Yeah, it does. And it also leads right into my next question, which is that one of my favorite parts of the book is when you talk about all these common romantic myths. And it made me realize all these socialized beliefs that I had around, oh, you should look for one long-term partner and all of these things. Can you talk a little bit more about relationship myths and how people can recognize and confront them?
Well, we started out in a culture, depending on where you grew up in this country, because we now have second and even third generation sluts growing up. I love it. But we started out in a culture that said that there was one gold standard of relationships, and that was somebody that you got together with and you stayed together with, and you celebrated your 50th anniversary and so on. And that's all fine and good. But that's not the culture that we actually live in. That's a very agrarian model of what a relationship should be, and it is not the only successful way to connect and relate to other people. There are tons and tons of ways. Most of us here in this room can expect to move through several relationships, major relationships in a lifetime. And if we are indeed open to it, perhaps a whole lot of other relationships that are valuable for whatever they're valuable for, because we're not actually trying to cement a relationship to work the farm so the children don't starve, you know? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's where those values come from, this idea that we have an invested survival interest in stable families. And you live in a world where, you know, you don't think a lot about changing jobs and so on. People I've worked with who work here think about not working here. Even though it's a very wonderful place to work, you know, they think about what they want to do and where they'll fit. And so the same is true of your relationships and the people that you love and who love you. They can be fabulous, profound relationships in a lot of different forms. I loved it when people started talking about friends with benefits. That doesn't sound cold with me, because through Svissy, I wound up sharing sex with a lot of my friends. Because we'd go to parties, whatever, you know, we were just there and available. And so friends and the concept that I got from the gay men of fuck buddies. Because to me, that's like a partner in exploration. We're going to climb this mountain. We're going to delve into this forest. You know, we're going to take care of each other while we go spelunking, as it were. And to me, that is another aspect of the many different ways our relationships can become very profound, in not necessarily being romantic, not necessarily being one and only, not necessarily even being what we call falling in love. Interesting that we call it falling. Sort of a stumble, I think. But also because we can love a lot more people, and why should we not include sex in those connections?
Can you talk a bit more about that? I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of the book, that there isn't a starvation economy for love, that you can love more than one person, and that doesn't mean you love any one person less.
Yeah. We are not taught that there's supposed to be sexual abundance. We're taught that men are supposed to seek for sexual abundance and women are supposed to be the brakes, mm-hmm. and go, oh no, I don't want to, not till that ring, and so on. I mean, it's a really dumb system if you think about it. But a lot of what we have in our culture prevents us from thinking outside that system, and I think it's a trap, frankly, that they don't want us to think outside of that system any more than they wanted slaves in the slavery era, where it was illegal to teach a slave how to read. It's a form of oppression, I believe, where you trap people by belief systems. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't fall in love and celebrate a 50th anniversary. That's just fine and dandy. If your life goes that way, that's just great. There's nothing wrong with that. But if your life is different from that, there should be room for that too. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. I'm really curious to know, do you think monogamy is realistic for most people?
If you really want to investigate this, read a book by my friends Judith Lipton and David Barish called The Myth of Monogamy. They are evolutionary researchers, and they did things like do DNA testing on all the chicks in a bird nest to find out that it's a wise bird who knows their own father. They found nests, for instance, and this reminded me of something, but they found nests where the male bird in the nest, and you have to have two birds. If you have a nest full of hatchlings in birdland, you can't feed them unless you have two birds. One bird can't do it. It's too much work. Mm-hmm. They will starve. And so there has to be two birds. But sometimes they would find that none of the male bird in the partnership or the other bird in the partnership, because there are Amazon birds, that they weren't related to any of the chicks biologically. And yeah, you laugh, and they actually used the word cuckold, but I thought that was really stupid. I had my closest life partner, my longest life partnership, who raised my daughter with me for 8 years, was a gay man. And we were great at homemaking. I think during that period of time we had sex 3 times, always involving other people. But because our relationship wasn't primarily sexual. It was primarily a relationship between people who were making home, and we were very active as sex educators, so we held all the meetings in our living room, and it was wonderful.
So is your answer to that question that the book is called The Myth of Monogamy?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't say that part.
Yeah. No, you did, but that answers it.
Yeah,
so.
The Myth of Monogamy, that's what they call it, and that's because they didn't find a lot of monogamy.
Yeah. So this is a question that somebody submitted to me beforehand. She said, I'm interested to hear what you think the role of gender and sexuality is in poly relationships. My experience has always been that there tends to be more fluid sexuality in poly couples, and would love to know what you think about that.
Well, I think I would go back a step, if that makes sense, because I think people who are attracted to poly have already looked at their gender roles. I really do think that's true, and maybe it's particularly true of women because we were supposed to, the world was supposed to operate on the fact that women weren't really interested in sex and only did it for England, but that's not true either. But the truth is that poly doesn't work very well with people who have not checked out what they were taught men and women were supposed to be. And that doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman or trans or any other or non-binary or any other category of gender. But of course, people who are not binary or people who are trans have already asked those questions. Many people grow up in parts of the United States where nobody questions that men do this. I've worked with a person who was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, and she had left that and built a wonderful life, but she wondered why she was so far behind in her career. And I said, well, did they educate you for working outside the home? Oh, no, you weren't supposed to. Women weren't supposed to do that. Did they send you to college? No, they didn't send women to college. So this still exists in the United States, often with the interesting threat, maybe, that this is the way God wants it. This is tremendously limited. So it works better if people have thought through what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and how they want to be in that area and what work they need to do to claim that territory. If you were raised to believe that you were always in some kind of competition or race, for instance, whether a man in his career or a woman with other women for desirable men, the looking at the world as if it's not a race can be a revelation. And then how do you have to change yourself in order to not constantly be wondering if you are ahead of or behind the person that you're talking to? Hierarchies kind of get thrown out the window in here.
Yeah. Well, that's a good transition to my next question, which is around when we first talked, you said you have a lot of clients who either work at Google or work in the tech industry, and I'd love to hear more about that and maybe the relationship between tech and open relationships or tech and polyamory and what you think the connection is.
Well, first of all, you're all very intelligent people, or you wouldn't be here. And that is the first thing on the list, that you think about things, and you wonder about things, and you question things, and this is good stuff. Mm-hmm. You are people who would be bored to tears working on an assembly line or something like that in a factory. Even if they paid you more than they did here, you would still be bored to tears and not tolerate it very well. So this is an interesting population of people. I find it interesting because when I was young, there was no built-in employment for smart kids. There wasn't any place you went that you could avoid being bored. The corporate ladder was kind of it, unless you went to medical school or something like that. And so this idea that there is now a playground for bright kids makes me very happy. And my understanding is that Google is very actively pursuing diversity in the population here. I know there's a lot of activity in women in tech, and that there's outreach to high school and even younger middle school students to see that all kids from all over the place get access, whether it's by gender or by social strata or whatever, get access to computers and can learn about them. So you live in a very privileged world here. And at the same time, it's a very high-pressure world. You work really, really hard. And some of you are in the position that a friend of mine who's a medical doctor told me he was told in medical school. When he went to medical school, they told them, this was when medical school, very few women went to medical school, said, get married right away because you're not going to have time to socialize. Well, particularly those of you who have worked in the game industry, you could easily be in a job where you don't have time to socialize. Polyamory requires an investment, and you're investing, and I don't like to see people look at marriage as sort of a convenience. So, you know, my socks get washed and my shirts get picked up at the dry cleaners, so I work, and I come home and I expect to be taken care of, and then who are those people at home who are doing the taking care of, and how do they count? And anyway, so, but that is something that is, I think, another question. A lot of you also, as bright kids in school, were, as I was, kind of social outcasts. They did a research project in a gifted program in 4th and 5th graders in California when the gifted program still existed in our schools. And they had a bunch of grad students looking at kids in recess and checking out the high IQ kids that had been identified and seeing how much time in recess they spent as leaders, followers, or outcasts. Believe it or not, these researchers were surprised to discover that the bright kids were almost never the leaders in grade school. You all know that. And so one of the things that happens when you have an assembly of very bright people is that a lot of us were not able to figure out how to socialize in middle school and high school. And we found a home for you. I didn't, because this didn't exist when I was young, but so many of you now found a home in front of a computer screen where you could be respected, where people could know you by your handle, by your whatever name you were using, and you could win respect being outrageous blogging or doing something very clever with computer games or something like that. And so a lot of very bright people get bullied in schools and get kind of obstacles to learning how they want to socialize or figuring out how we want to socialize. So sometimes it's hard. A lot of us are kind of shy and awkward.
Yeah. So I heard Dan Savage speak last week, and he said the most common question he gets is, am I normal?
My question is, do you want to be normal, really?
Right.
Yeah.
Normal, you may interest you to know, is 1.75 minutes of fucking. That's normal, okay? Do you want to be normal? I don't think so. You're way too smart for that. So I throw that up. It's important when you're looking at research, because statistical research has taken normal as right. Mm-hmm. Now, normal is an IQ of 100, and actually that's, in terms of here, that would be way low. Normal is not really, doesn't actually include people who are explorers, who are looking out of the box, who are creative thinkers, who do something well. You're not normal if you do anything well, you see? Now, and you know, you all in intelligence, a couple of standard deviations above normal, 3 or 4 maybe. And so normal is kind of deceptive, because it's taken, and when we think of normal in sexuality and sexual behavior, it's taken in a culture with a history of tremendous sexual oppression, using that word normal, saying, oh no, it's not normal. It's, when I started as a sex educator, it was considered pathological to masturbate. We have changed the world on that one. And you know, I mean, that's crazy.
That's true. It's interesting to see what's normal now, what was normal, what will be normal in the future. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, people still jacked off. I mean, they just did it with, you know, they were ashamed of themselves for doing it, which is really bad.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about jealousy. I think that's something that people often wonder about. How do people manage jealousy, and what are the expectations around jealousy? Does it not exist in a polyamorous relationship, or do people just handle it differently?
People handle it differently. Of course it exists. After all these years, I still get jealous, and I have been consciously poly for more than 50 years now. Jealousy is not one thing. If we were to ask around this room, we would find out, I don't have my whiteboard here, this was the whiteboard question. We would find out that for one person here, when they get jealous, they get angry. If another person gets insecure, another person feels very territorial, another person fears abandonment, another person goes, oh my God, I should have lost those 20 pounds. And they're very, very different experiences. Jealousy is interesting in that it's not really an emotion, it's a word we use for a stimulus that may cause strong emotions and may frighten us. We've been taught that we are supposed to take our security from our life partnerships, from our marriages, from our relationships. And that security is supposed to include, this is one of the biggest myths of all, the idea that our partner is not attracted to anybody else but us. Which is really probably not true. Matter of fact, if you look at this, people think people who watch porn are, I always am very amused by these things about the statistics of these terrible people who watch porn and they all turn into serial killers. You know, it's like, you start out by saying this is a multi-billion-dollar industry of criminals that we must stop. Well, who do you think is providing those multi-billion dollars if it isn't all of us? So there's a lot of what is normal, what is. You were asking about jealousy. I'm sorry, I got off track. What I look at with jealousy is we start with the sort of axiom in the society that jealousy is an intolerable emotion. Mm-hmm. I recall one of my clients coming into the office one day, say she had talked to her girlfriend about her boyfriend's behavior, and her boyfriend was indeed being a jerk. But and her girlfriend said, well, he just gave you a license to go ballistic. Ballistic. And I thought about that, and I said, do you actually own a gun? And she didn't, so we could relax. But, you know, you think about that. Hey, Joe, where are you going with that gun in your hand? I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than see you with another man. And there's equivalent stuff for women as well, that the world comes to an end if you find out that your partner has had sex or wants to have sex with somebody else. And so we've taught ourselves that jealousy is its own kind of emotional tyrant because the belief system is that jealousy is intolerable, that it is inevitable, and that it is unchangeable. Interestingly enough, brain science has given us, all this wonderful functional MRI research, a different story. And the story is that when people get jealous, often we are triggered. An emotional triggering is something that if you get upset really fast about something and you feel very overwhelmed, you start flooding and it feels like a big emergency and I gotta run away or I gotta freeze or I gotta fight or something like that. That's what triggering is. It's actually a physiological function of organs called the amygdalas in our brains that are there to teach us to run away from tigers.
Mm-hmm. The amygdala hijack, yeah.
Yep, hijacks the whole nervous system. So when that happens, we're all flooding with adrenaline and norepinephrine, and all the sugar in your cells goes into your bloodstream so you can run better. You become insulin, you become able to ignore your insulin, which is why some people with stressful childhoods are now identified as a cause of diabetes, because it messes up the sugar system so badly. And that stuff is what seems intolerable. But the interesting truth is that if you accept that your system's been hijacked, and you are no longer able to, for instance, you can't do conflict resolution in this state of mind, forget it. All you want is for that other person to be wrong and you to be proved right. You know, it's a very blinding kind of state. And but if you manage to take care of yourself without re-stimulating whatever it was that set you off, whatever that trigger was, for as little as 15 minutes, your physiology will return to its normal state. And if you're having a fight with your partner, now standard couples therapy says that what you do is you separate for 15 minutes and take a time out and do whatever it takes to occupy yourself in a positive and supportive way. Go hug a tree, I don't know, whatever. Why is that a bad thing to do, tree huggers? That's weird. And then if you come back and look at what's happening, you'll be able to see it more clearly. And this will get you through a lot of problems in partnerships, really. Just stop. Go occupy your mind in some positive way. I am a meditator, but I don't find meditation, maybe I'm not good enough at it, but I don't find it an easy thing to do at moments like that, because I need something that occupies my verbal thought train while I'm starting up going, you just want me in the corner crying, don't you? That kind of thinking is hard to ignore. Crossword puzzles help. But what happens when you calm yourself down, every time you do that, every time you self-soothe, integrating fibers grow into the amygdala that deliver gabapentin, which is endogenous Valium. And you get to keep the fibers. So every time you succeed in soothing yourself when you're triggered, you gain in physiological resources for calming yourself down. Does this make sense? So the goal with jealousy is not that it goes away, but that that it is changed from a typhoon to kind of a gentle summer shower. And you go, oh, wow, I'm feeling jealous. Mm-hmm. How shall I take care of myself? Matter of fact, it's even affirming just to say, every time I feel jealous, I go be nice to myself. I mean, that's interesting. It's not necessarily logical, but it works.
That's really helpful. I'm going to go take a time out next time. Okay, yeah. So I wanted to share a story with you. My friend told me the story a few years ago that she's in an open relationship and her therapist is really supportive, but then one day she brought up the idea of having a child with her primary, and the therapist sort of freaked out. And you've talked a bit about having a child, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on child rearing in non-traditional environments.
Well, I was very lucky that this came to me right after I had my daughter, who is now in her 40s, and we are very close, and it's a good thing. And it all worked. But she was only 3 months old then. And I wound up connecting with a lot of other parents, a lot of extended families of sluts that were often, Society for Creative Anachronism, Renaissance Fair, science fiction, computer people. Is that familiar by any means? Oh, I forgot pagan. And we all had kids, and what that meant was that we were doing our initial lessons in having a polyamorous extended family in a way in which we could not compartmentalize our relationships. Everybody knew everybody. Our children played with everybody else's children. We could go to sex parties because somebody would stay home and throw a pajama party for the kids. These were our children's brothers and sisters. Which took care of the problem that many of us were having a 1 or 2 child family, because that's what middle-class modern people do. And so we were, so our kids didn't have as many siblings as they might have had. So if I was dating somebody and then we came to a bad thing and we didn't want to do that anymore and we wanted to change, we couldn't go hunt, because we would have to rip our children out of their family to do it. So much like the serial monogamy of people who get divorced and remarried, when you have children, there's a lot of reason to say, well, we should all decide that we're on the same side because we're raising this child. And we need to figure out what our best behavior is and what kind of role model we want to present for our children. And that gave us a lot of impetus and a lot of desire to not act like idiots and go, I'll never speak to you again, because I was going to have to speak to that person again, and or lose my entire support system. And so we learned to speak to each other, even after terrible breakups and painful misconnections, And I thought that was a very good thing. Our kids just benefit. Kids are designed to grow up in little villages of maybe 40 people in tribes. And babies, they're like puppies. If you've ever had a friend who had a puppy and you went and played with the puppy and you came back 6 months later and it seemed like the puppy recognized you, babies are like that. They can register about 40 people, possibly more, I don't know. That was about what we had. And they love each other. I mean, they're just happy. They recognize people. They know what it is. And this means that the child has a lot of adult resources, and the parents have a lot of resources, because that minimizes the time we spend losing sleep with screaming babies and feeling like we're exhausted or taken beyond our resources. Children are very challenging to raise. It's very hard raising young children. It's a lot of work. And if you have plenty of adults around to share the burden, it becomes more of a joy and a lot easier.
If you're comfortable speaking about it, I'd love to hear how your daughter reflects on her childhood.
You will all understand this. My daughter, being the daughter of me, we have an agreement that I do not speak in any specific way about her life.
I figured that
you might figure out that if I were
possibility.
your mom, you might want it that way too.
Makes sense, yeah. So what's your relationship between polyamory and feminism?
Well, when I started out, that was the beginning of my feminism. I was determined to, I decided in that day, and I was coming out of a very scary relationship that had really everything to do with sexism and nothing to do with it, because my partner, my daughter's father, had his first psychotic episode after we decided to have a child, and became paranoid schizophrenic, which happens sometimes. Some forms of mental illness occur in adulthood. We were both 25. And he became dangerous and violent and scary, so I was quite traumatized when I got there. But I was also very angry. I was really aware that he was taking out his frustrations by hitting me and threatening to kill me and chasing me around with knives and all kinds of intolerable stuff. I had to leave. I mean, it was like, I can't raise a child in this. This is impossible. And so it was a big lesson, because what is it in the culture that says that if you're feeling small, one way you can go about feeling big and feeling more powerful if you're feeling powerless is to take someone smaller than you and make them feel even smaller yet. This is one of the basic difficulties of sexism and of how we look at sexuality. Prison sex is like this. The person who penetrates is believed to gain power. The person who is penetrated is believed to lose power, become lower in the hierarchy. Janet said this, quoted me on this to somebody who answered, "Oh yeah, but that's true, isn't it?" And she said, "Oh, you mean sort of like plugging in an electrical cord to the circuit?" I like that metaphor. Yeah, where is the power? Where is the power? So it was a big part of my feminism, both to grasp my sexuality the way I wanted to grasp it, and to, I decided not to be partnered for 5 years so that I could find out who I was when I wasn't trying to be somebody's wife. That was real important to me. I vowed to take my relationships with women seriously, and wound up in relationships with women and even identifying as a dyke. And all of that was part of me finding out who I was and starting to value the parts of me that I had been taught were not valuable because they were unwomanly. Like, for instance, being intelligent. We'll get back to that one. And so it was a great voyage of exploration for me. I consider myself a reformed clinging vine. But what's interesting in polyamory, when you're looking at what kind of a grown-up you're going to be in whatever you were told you should be, is that every relationship, you have to decide what you want the boundaries of that relationship to be. You have to create it. You have to be aware of what its limits are going to be. And this is very strengthening, because the power belongs to each of us to make those decisions about how we want to regard any given relationship in our lives, instead of trying to be somebody else's version of what a relationship is supposed to look like.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah. So the first edition of The Ethical Slut came out in 1999. And then was that right?
Yeah, 1997 actually.
Oh,
yes.
1997, and then the second version came out in 2009. I'd love to hear what changes you made over that period of time, and then what changes you might hope or expect to see 10 years from now.
Okay. First, I want to give a total vote of confidence and thanks. Thanks to Janet, my co-author. Thanks to my lovers and my lovers' lovers and all those people. But also, particularly thanks for my clients, because the difference between those two books was however many years it was, 12 years or something, of me seeing people in my office who maybe came from parts of the culture that I would not normally have met them. Maybe they were conservative for me, more conservative than me. That's pretty easy. So I got to learn a lot. And a lot of that learning, what happened was, because of the first edition was popular and got around to a lot of places, I learned how a lot of different people do poly. And that was something that is reflected in here. There's a lot more diversity in here, I think. The other piece was that I had been doing a lot of work, so I had exercises that I did as homework, and we included those exercises in here. So there's an aspect of the second edition that you can use it like a workbook and try things and find out, that might guide your exploration into who you want to be as a slut. And how you want your life to be, and what kind of agreements you might want to make with your various partners, and so on. So that's new. We have some stuff, but not an awful lot about internet sex, because neither of us are. Well, Janet is kind of. Maybe I don't notice it because she wrote it, because I don't do it. Somebody else needs to write that book. We are not millennials. We didn't grow up with computers. So that's not so much in there, but there is also just some expansion. There's new chapters. There's a chapter on being a single slut, and a long nice long discussion of the rights and responsibilities that become sort of like saying, well, if I'm a single slut and I am an outsider to somebody's marriage, but I'm a member of that family by virtue of fucking someone who's in it, then what are my rights? What are my responsibilities? And the rights part is important. Because if you look at these people who say they're going to cure your marriage of having affairs, right? The first thing they talk about is who they're going to dump, and they think that other person, they treat them like they're not a human. That other person doesn't count. Get rid of them. They're a homewrecker or some such thing, you know? They don't count. And in fact, everybody counts in poly. So if I don't honor my lover's other relationships, I am failing as a poly person. If they don't honor my presence there, then they are failing me. And so that part I think is real important, and it's in here. And the other thing that's in here is a chapter called Opening a Poly Relationship. And curiously enough, that one wound up having a big section on cheating. The reason being that a lot of people came into my office where, in fact, wanting to open a relationship that in fact was already open, only one partner didn't know that. Sometimes both partners didn't know that. And so I began to realize that a lot of people come to thinking about poly and thinking maybe this is an answer for me because they have been cheating. And I started looking at that kind of differently. I also see a lot of sex workers, and I haven't ever seen this thing, but one of my sex worker friends, who's a sex worker activist, was writing her master's degree, her master's thesis on family structures, including the sex workers as in members of the family. Not maybe known to most of the members of the family, but they're there and they're part of the ecology of the whole system, right? They're providing an important sustenance of sorts, you know? And so I also got a lot of sex workers' clients. And in fact, if you're cheating, seeing a sex worker is a more honorable way to cheat, because the idea that to be honorable and cheat, your partner is never supposed to know. That's the honorable way of cheating, okay? I know that sounds crazy, but there is an ethics to it. And for people who felt that their partners would never allow them, for instance, to explore SM or to explore gender or to explore whatever it is, who had husbands and wives and children and houses and families that they valued. And they didn't want to have to leave their families in order to explore more completely who they are by trying on these various roles. Sex work becomes a way with good boundaries that is about as honorable as it can get. Because the other thing in poly is that we do take it that desire is important. That when I have a desire, when I have a fantasy that calls to me, that I can benefit from listening to that call. If I am free, if I've set up my life so I'm free, that I can go and just answer that call. Because one of the things poly gives you is you can have relationships with people that you would not dream of sharing a checkbook with. And but you can find out what that call is. You can find out who that attractive person is, and presuming that you respect them and they respect you, you're in business, right? Yeah. And you don't have to be preparing to share a mortgage or raise children with that person.
Well, this has been fascinating, and definitely the most times I've heard the word fuck used in a talk to Google. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, right. You know,
so we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I see a lot of interested faces here.
I do want to say something while we're getting the mic organized about the word fuck. There's no other active verb to describe that activity. We have sex, we get nookie, we get lucky, we coppa feel. We often steal, but the language is all about sex as something, a thing that you get. And so fucking is the only verb that says this is something that you do. It's the way I use it so much. Pardon?
Screw, mate.
Copulate.
Screw, copulate. Well, copulate is another way. It's like saying the only clean words are ones that are multisyllabic in dead languages. It's true that copulate and fornicate are fine. They're there. They sound like diseases.
Great. Okay, let's start with the question over here.
Not to diss the word polyamory, but it is a multisyllabic word in a dead language.
Yeah,
two dead languages.
Yes.
So I have like 60 questions I could ask, but I think the one that probably hit me most is you are delightfully pandering to this audience. I appreciate that. We're all smart people, yada, yada, yada. We're all privileged to be in this environment. in my circles, I have had often the sort of accusation, maybe, levied that poly is something for rich white people, or some flavor of that you have to be in a certain economic class or situation in order for it to be okay. My own experience differs greatly from that, but I'm wondering how much you've heard that and what your response to that sort of framing is.
Well, I think that there is a certain amount of truth in it, in the sense that we have to recognize, I talked about agrarian families where they get together so the children don't starve, right? Well, we have families in this country, often farming families, or often families. I'm a first-generation American. My family came over to this country. My grandparents were domestic servants. So I come from a very working-class background. My parents clawed their way up to white-collar jobs, and were very dedicated to getting education for us. So that kind of cemented family has been very important for people who are getting a toehold in this world, especially people who immigrate from elsewhere. People coming into this country from Syria, the great debate now, are going to need their families the way most of the people in this room don't. Most of you can leave your blood families and can leave a partner without putting yourself in danger of starving or having no job or no life. That doesn't mean you can necessarily come out of the closet everywhere, not even here, but you have that freedom, and many people in the culture don't. So I think there is a kind of there is a certain privilege associated with this. Now, many young people of families like my family, immigrant families that worked really hard to get a foothold in the culture, including those who had a harder job than my family, because my family is Northern European, so I'm white, so I have an advantage in that. That's a privilege. That children, we're seeing a lot more people from immigrant families and from poor families and so on in this generation, in places like here and in the sex world. It has been largely a very white world, the world of sex parties and sex clubs and all that kind of stuff, and a very middle-class educated world. So sometimes we have to realize, and how do we welcome people who come from the world that I grew up in, this world when my parents lived through 2 world wars and the Depression. They were in danger of starving. And so their values, I came to realize, were different from mine, because they had been endangered in a way that they had raised me that I was never endangered. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of privilege in there, I agree. Yeah. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It just means that there's a lot of privilege, and we should acknowledge that.
Another question right there.
So you mentioned earlier when you talked about educated people, etc., you talked about video game culture and being outcast, etc. In recent years, it's been very clear that this video game culture has actually been very toxic to anti-feminist, very sexist and male-centric. Even though supposedly we are out. So can you say anything about that point?
Yeah, I think that Mortal Kombat Black Ops is not really the best thing to feed your children. I really don't think it's the best thing at all. And I think it is an unfortunate part of our culture that we decide that the way we're going to get adrenaline raisers in this world is not by going and doing something exciting with our friends, which we could do, but by pretending to kill lots of people. I remember running across a little boy who was about 10 years old who was playing a video game many years ago, the first time I'd ever seen it. And I looked at the game, and I said, "Does anything ever pop up you're not supposed to shoot?" And he said, "No, that's interesting." So yeah, I think there is a big question about this culture, and yet again, I mean, there are less. These are ways that people develop computer skills. They really do, and so they are now a part of our learning experience for everybody. I think that the idea that it's so much about combat and that there is a whole bunch of very, very sexist, with the occasional woman hero, you know, but that's been happening for a while. I recently had a big surgery and had to figure out how to rest a lot, and did 132 episodes of Xena Warrior Princess.
That's great.
answer your question right there.
So on the topic of jealousy, you were talking about how with experience and you develop kind of an emotional maturity, a physiological maturity. But have you, in your experience, had clients in therapy or elsewhere that are younger but have found ways to handle jealousy in a mature way?
Of course, absolutely. People grow up in different circumstances. For instance, the triggers from the amygdala. I am a survivor of a violent childhood, so I know this. In people who are trauma survivors, there is a lot more. The triggers are bigger. They're harder to deal with. They are more work. So in people who've had very unsafe childhoods or very triggered, I've had people who had incredibly hard time because a father left the family with no resources whatsoever, and they were homeless and whatever, terrible traumas that can be associated with this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And so some people have a much harder job to do if they want to overcome the triggers. And there you have another question, because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work for people who haven't been so traumatized, but it's a lot of work to learn to operate your own triggers. Now, there's a benefit, obviously, because that means that your triggers don't own you in any situation. Mm-hmm. So if you work on them because you want the freedom to fuck around, there you go again, but that's what I do. And slut, one syllable word in English, then you're... then you want to do that work because you want to claim your freedom. And one of the places where this becomes difficult with some people that come into my office are people who actually have no desire whatsoever to do the work, and if they were going to do it, it would be only to please or perhaps hold on to a spouse. Mm-hmm. And that's not enough motivation for a lot of people because it's a painful. There is no way around jealousy. You have to go through it. You have to be willing to experience it and start to work with it and take care of yourself and nurture yourself while you're having it. You can't just count on avoiding it. Mm-hmm. And so for the person who never wanted to do this in the first place, it can become something that they do not have the resources to conquer. I take great pride that some of the people in these situations who come to my office decide to be monogamous. Mm-hmm. Because I don't want to be a therapist who's shoving my agenda down people's throats. I'm willing to be there. But I am not willing to say that they ought to be different from how they are. I'm willing to say this is the work that needs to be done, and it's hard because X, Y, Z, and you have to decide if it's worth doing for you or if you'd rather wait 10 years till the children are older, What is it that, whatever is real in your life? Thank you for that question. It's a good question.
Really appreciate you sharing your perspective from like the late 60s all the way through now in terms of seeing the tremendous social change that's happened around how we perceive and think about sexuality. Mm-hmm. I want to revisit actually the question from before. So between the first and second edition, and then maybe down the road, what kinds of changes you might anticipate, or what kinds of developments or trends would you see between like now and maybe the third edition or in the decades ahead?
Yeah, we're actually sort of getting there. They want you to do another edition every 10 years or so. It's like publicity and so on. But I'm not really sure. I think that we would have to look at it. I kind of learned it in the process of doing it, and I don't have a clear vision about what I could add. The one thing, there is some stuff, the brain science I quoted you is also quoted in this book, in this edition. It's not in the first edition because the research hadn't happened yet. And so I'm going to assume there's going to be more research about emotions and about states of consciousness by then. And that's what my interest is. I'm working on a book called Shadow Play about journeys into shadow and why do we find Little Red Riding Hood of the Big Bad Wolf a big sexy story, and what happens if we decide to do a role play, and where do we get to go and journey and what happens. And so that's what I'm kind of interested in exploring right now. The intersection of Eros and kind of Jungian shadow stuff. And that's what's interesting me. But I don't know what the next book would bring. It's kind of an adventure. When we go to write it, we kind of live with them when we're writing it. This book brought many surprises as well.
One of the things when I was first exploring the sort of expressions of polyamory in society, I'd always felt something along these lines, but learning about how people talk about polyamory, there was a great deal of distinction between sort of rules-based poly and this idea of hierarchy, where you have primary relationships and secondary, where versus other people who have sort of something some people are calling relationship anarchy, where everything is consistently negotiated, and there's all sorts of different formulations. I guess I'm not interested in a historical examination of that, but as a psychologist, where do you find people best make use of rules, best make use of flexibility? Like, how does that play out in your experience with clients and in your own experience?
Well, you'll see in the book that I don't talk about rules, I talk about agreements. And sometimes I get snarky with my clients. I say, you broke an agreement. I guess you didn't agree about that, huh? There we are. And sometimes that's something that I come down on. I mean, if it's safer sex, I care about that a lot. Sometimes it's like something that you go, well, how are you guys going to negotiate? Why don't we talk about what the emotional cost is of both of your positions, right? Relationship anarchy is an interesting notion. And I hear it in two different ways. I have always been a person who I guess would be described as a relationship anarchist, but I've never used that language because I don't like, in general, the kind of dualism that's about rankings and hierarchies. I'm wandering around snarkily saying, you know, how many Olympic athletes can you name that won bronze medals, you know? We only count the people at the top of the ladder, you know, and that means nobody counts, or very few people count, and that's a drag. My understanding is that we need agreements in some degree, and this varies enormously by people. Some degree of predictability is important. Almost no one can tolerate simply being blindsided constantly. So if anarchist means I won't make agreements, that's a problem. If anarchist means we negotiate the agreements as they fit, and if I have a wonderful poly family in my practice who are currently pregnant with there's an originating couple who are married legally, and then they each are married to someone else in a way that is not legal but pagan, and they are planning to have children in all these combinations. And I have a friend who's a family lawyer who understands this kind of, loves this challenge. I'm like, okay, you go visit Dylan and have him make whatever agreements you guys can figure out how to make about how you're going to deal with the college fund and so on. If you're having children between all these different sets of parents in one family. And they are doing a beautiful job of it. It's amazing. They support each other when people have a hard time. They all get in there and help out the person who's feeling bad, even if they start out by expressing it by being very angry about something or whatever. So it can be a very nice thing. And in that sense, people, you know, it's interesting because the thing about adrenaline raisers in the games, there's a relationship between structure and risk that has to do with how awake we get. There's actually an ideal, in any situation, it's kind of an ideal balance between structure, which is safety, and risk, which is expansive and maybe challenging. Because if it's too structured, it feels too safe. It's boring, and people get restless. And if it's too unstructured, too anarchist, if you will, then people get scared because they can't find their place. This comes from research into groups. Where people work the best and function the best is in some balance in between.
State of flow.
Yep.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? It's a little abstract.
Yeah, kind of. I would quibble with some of the ways you use the word anarchist, but I get what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, but you nodded to me. By the way, he nodded when I said if anarchist means that you don't make agreements, you shook your head, and I agree. That's quite true.
I think we should continue that conversation over lunch, but I feel so grateful that you came and that I work in a place where we could have this conversation, and it's really been eye-opening to have you here, so thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.